So in today's webinar, we're going to be talking about higher education and review. This workshop is meant to talk about the structure of the different higher education systems that we have here in Minnesota, as well as talk about the governance structure within MINSK itself. And then lastly, we're going to just talk a little bit about what happened over the last couple of legislative sessions so that you have an idea on campus of what issues might be coming up for you in this next year. Minnesota has two public higher education systems in the state, and that's actually pretty unusual for higher ed systems to have, for states to have two public higher education systems. But we do in Minnesota, and the first is the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities, or MINSK system, of which all of our two-year colleges are a part of. And the second public system is the University of Minnesota. So both of those exist as publicly funded but separate entities in the state of Minnesota. In addition to those institutions, we also have a variety of private colleges and universities in the state. Some are for-profit and some are not for-profit, but we have a pretty thriving private sector here in the state. All of these sectors of higher education are coordinated by the Office of Higher Education, which is a governor's level agency in the state. So their job at the Office of Higher Ed is not to provide a lot of oversight for the sectors, but to help coordinate registering those institutions as well as administering our state financial aid systems. I want to focus in more directly on our MINSK system, of which our two-year colleges are all a part of. The MINSK system was created in 1995. It was created through a legislative initiative in order to bring all of our two-year community and technical colleges, as well as our 7 state universities, into one system. Prior to 1995, all of our technical colleges were actually run through the K-12 districts across the state, and our community colleges were run as separate entities. So merging them as a system brought a lot of value to these institutions, as they were able to better leverage their power at the legislature in asking for funding. Prior to 1995, each of these colleges had to go individually to the legislature and ask for funding. So this allowed them to kind of pool their resources and work better together. It also allowed the system to help institution to institution, so to create shared services between colleges, so that not every college had to have their own attorney, not every college had to have their own completely separate IT structure, that we're able to think about how we can centralize some of those to run our colleges and universities more efficiently. Again, the University of Minnesota was not included in the merger of those public schools, which is how we came to have the two separate systems. We're going to talk a little bit about why that is a little bit later. In addition to efficiency and centralized services, allowing all the institutions together created a new level of governance. So a central place that can provide some oversight over our colleges and universities to make sure that they're providing the best value, most quality education for students. Most of you probably know that our MINSK colleges are funded through two general streams of revenue. The first being from state appropriations, so money given to the system by the state legislature, and the other is through tuition dollars. So those are the two streams of revenue that come in. Under state statute, it's the goal of Minnesota to fund 2/3 the cost of education, with tuition making up that additional third. However, at this point in time, the MINSK system actually gets over 60% of its funding from tuition, which means that it's resulted in almost a complete reversal of the tuition and state appropriation relationship. And a lot of that can be attributed to cuts in higher ed funding that we've seen over the last decade. The MINSK system currently has over 416,000 students. Many of those students are part-time. Some of those students are only taking one class, so that's just head count, the number of students that are actually enrolled on our campuses across the state. And again, that's the colleges and the universities. And something unique about the MINSK system is it's the only public system in Minnesota that's actually subject to legislative oversight, meaning not just that the legislature can decide how much money to provide to our colleges and universities, but they can also make policy decisions on behalf of the system. They can tell the system what to do in areas outside of merely funding. Um, our colleges and universities have several institutional missions. One is a broad liberal arts education, so developing critical thinking skills, taking general education courses. That applies to many of you that are enrolled in AA programs across the state, bachelor degree programs, as well as our technical programs also have some liberal education, general education requirements. Career and technical training is a huge component of our college's missions across the state. Finding ways to align the needs of the workforce and employers with the kind of educational programs that we're providing to its citizens. And that makes MINSK a little unique, especially compared to the University of Minnesota. Customized training is also a large role within the MINSK system, and that's developing custom courses and programs meant to train current employees of employers across the state. So developing a specific subset of skills that a specific employer needs, and allowing their employees to take those courses not for credit. The University of Minnesota, on the other hand, is often thought of as the flagship school within Minnesota. However, they have far fewer campuses than the MINSK system. Within MINSK, we have about 47 different institutions, actual campuses, and at the University of Minnesota, they have 5 campuses and 65,000 students as opposed to the over 400,000 that MINSK has. So even though they're thought of as the flagship school, the MINSK system actually serves a much larger population of students in many more communities across the state. And the University of Minnesota definitely also shares a lot of the liberal education focuses of our colleges, but they also split their focus between that type of education and their research mission. The University of Minnesota prides itself on being a research institution. Some of our MINSK schools do engage in their own independent research, but that's not one of the primary missions of our schools. And I mentioned that MINSK has legislative oversight in terms of giving MINSK direction, telling them what they can do, making policy decisions. And that's not the case at the University of Minnesota. They are a public school, so the legislature decides how much money to give them, but they're not in a position to tell the University of Minnesota what type of policy decisions that they have to make. And that's kind of an oddity. And the reason that that is in statute and is the way it is because the University of Minnesota is what's known as a land grant institution. And a land grant institution is a college or university that was actually established prior to the state being established in the Union. So here it was established in 1851, so actually before Minnesota was a state. And when Minnesota was established and we wrote our Constitution, we gave some rights to the University of Minnesota because it was pre-existing and told it that it could continue to have all its rights and immunities that it had previously had before Minnesota was established as a state. And so that is why the University of Minnesota is independent from MINSK, and it's why the University of Minnesota can't be told what to do in a lot of the same ways that the MINSK colleges and universities can. To talk a little bit about the distinction between the public sector and private schools across the state, we have private four-year colleges or universities that are largely nonprofit, although there are some for-profit four-year schools. And then we also have a lot of private for-profit institutions, many at the two-year level. These private colleges don't receive direct state aid, so they're not given appropriations and funding in the same way that the University of Minnesota and our MINSK schools are. However, their students are eligible for financial aid. So, in a very real way, the state of Minnesota does provide financial assistance to private schools by way of their students. So, students can take not only federal loans, federal grants like the Pell or the SIA grant, but they can also bring in state dollars from the Minnesota State Grant Program. And these private colleges, because they're privatized, are almost completely free from state oversight. The state doesn't control the purse strings of these organizations, so the only real way the state can get involved in regulatory matters is if private colleges are breaking a state law. A little more focused conversation about the MINSK system itself. When you look at how many full-time two-year students we have in the system, it's close to 100,000. So, MSCSA and the student senates across the state are certainly representing a large chunk of students within Minnesota. Our schools are very online intensive, which I'm sure is not a surprise to most people that are on this webinar today. Many of the students that I talk to have taken at least one online course in their education. And actually, MINSK for the first time just a couple springs ago hit their 100,000th student enrolled in an online course. And right now we offer 10,000 courses online throughout the system. You know that MINSK comprises the majority of state undergraduates just by sheer numbers, but on a percentage basis, we educate 63% of all the undergraduates in the state. So definitely talking about the majority of students here in our system. And then just a little note on tuition, that the tuition average for the current school year, 2012-2013, is just over $5,300, so $5,370. And that actually puts us at the third highest in terms of tuition and fees in the nation and the highest in the Midwest. So tuition, as you all know, is a concern to our students. Affordability is one of the major tenets of our mission statement as an organization. And so, our students are concerned and wanting to push forward initiatives to control affordability into the future. I want to talk a little bit about governance within the system. We have so many disparate institutions across the state that there needs to be some sort of oversight or centralized coordination of our schools. And we do that here in the MINSK system through the Board of Trustees. The board is comprised of 15 members. The members generally represent regions across the state, but there's also a labor representative that serves on the board. There are 3 at-large members, and all of those folks serve 6-year terms. Now, if you're doing the math and you add that up, that only equals 12. So you might be asking, who are the other 3 members of the board? Well, those are actually students. And we're very fortunate in Minnesota to have 3 students that are appointed to the board by the governor, because these students, although they serve 2-year terms, are full voting members of the board. And in many other states, there either aren't students on the board at all, or if they are on the board, they serve in an ex officio way, so they're not voting on issues. And here in MINSK, we have 1 student that represents the community colleges, 1 that represents the technical colleges, and then 1 that represents the university students as well. And we just had some recent appointments to the board, which we'll talk about in a moment. But our current student representatives, our university student trustee is Brett Anderson. And then our technical college trustee is Alfredo Oliveira, who is actually just reappointed to a second 2-year term. And our community college trustee is Maria Peluso, who's a student at Itasca Community College. Talk a little bit about outside of the Board of Trustees, who's in charge. Now, MINSK adheres to a principle that's called shared governance, which is common throughout many colleges and universities nationally. And there's a lot of different ways to define shared governance. But this is one of the best examples that I could find. And this actually comes from a student government website from another state. And they talk about shared governance, meaning that a decision has been fully, deliberately, and inclusively considered and then communicated. And it means that you're making efforts to inform and you're providing opportunities for participation. And so that's very important. This principle of shared governance is what allows your students on campus to participate in Senate, to serve on campus-wide committees, search committees, budget committees, finance committees, and it allows MSCSA as a statewide organization to appoint students to statewide decision-making processes and committees. So I want to take a couple of minutes and just have you think about how you see shared governance in action on your own campus. So just reflect on this as we're talking here, and then maybe at the end of the call, I can hear a couple of examples for how you see this in action on campus. So why do you think that shared governance is important? That can be on your campus, in your Senate, or on a statewide level. And then secondly, how do you see shared governance in action on your campus? What types of committees are your students involved in? Where do you see that idea of inclusive participation in decision making? So I'll just give everyone a few seconds to think about that. All right, so we'll share some examples of that at the end of this webinar. So who's involved in shared governance? Obviously the students, I've talked about that, but there's other folks as well. So the legislature is involved in shared governance in a very real way, in that they are a decision-making body. They decide how much money our system gets and how our schools need to operate. The Board of Trustees, obviously, that's the governing board. They are decision makers, so they're involved in this process. The chancellor, also a decision maker. The current chancellor of our system is Stephen Rosenstone, and he just finished his first year as chancellor in our system. And so he has taken on a very active role in defining a strategic plan for the system moving forward. And some of those initiatives are what is going to inform conversations and the shared governance decision-making process over the next few years. Vice chancellors, now these are senior level staff members that work at the system office under the chancellor's guidance. And then presidents, the presidents of our colleges and universities make up a group called the Leadership Council within MINSK, and they are a decision-making body, or recommending body as well. Provosts, those of you that attend a college where you have multiple campuses, you probably have a provost, and they are certainly involved in the shared governance process, as well as students that we talked about, faculty members, both at a campus level and system level, and staff are also involved in shared governance as well. There are also other decision makers that might not be explicitly involved in the shared governance process, but are certainly influencing the discussion around higher education in Minnesota. The vice chancellors, in addition to their shared governance role, are also making everyday decisions on policy issues. Associate vice chancellors, who also work under those vice chancellors in divisions at the system office. Other staff at the system office and on campus, students, and then we have all of the union groups across the state. So we have MSCF, Minnesota State College Faculty Association, representing the two-year college faculty, the Interfaculty Organization, representing the four-year university faculty, MAPE, which is a statewide union that represents some staff on our campuses, MUSAF, which is the Minnesota State University Administrative and Service Faculty on our campuses, specific to the 4 years, as well as AFSCME, which again is another statewide union that has members as staff on campuses. In addition to those groups, lawmakers are decision makers, both individually as well as as the legislature as a whole. And then lastly, the media. The media stories that come out about the policy decisions of the system or the funding decisions of the legislature or even our work as students can influence how people perceive the state of higher education here in Minnesota. So that's basically an overview of the structure of higher education across the state. I want to move more specifically into the status of higher ed. Where are we as a system, and where are we legislatively going into this new academic year? So first, just a word on some system issues. I mentioned we have a new chancellor. He's been in place now for a year, and he's making some significant changes through his strategic framework. And he has an action plan that goes along with that, and they have a lot of big ideas that the Board of Trustees and our college presidents are talking about. One is transforming online learning across the state and finding ways to provide better access to higher quality online learning experiences. Credit transfer is going to be a big issue for this chancellor, which is something that we've worked really hard on as an organization, so we're excited to see more conversation about. Affordability, the chancellor has made it clear that he wants to provide students the most affordable, highest value option for higher education in the state. So affordability is key to that. And as we know, because our tuition fees are so high, affordability in many cases it is threatened as we move even farther away from state investment. Completion rates. Completion is something that's huge in the higher ed conversation nationally, but here in the MINSK system, talking about how do we get more students to complete degrees, to complete credentials, to complete diploma programs, or to successfully transfer between institutions. And then lastly, access, making sure that all Minnesotans have access to what the chancellor calls an extraordinary education. So those are all going to be topics of conversation on your campuses throughout the next several years. Additionally, there are several climate issues that are affecting conversations at the system level. One is there's been more of a move towards shared services, better collaboration between institutions. How can we be more efficient by centralizing those things that don't affect the quality of your education or the independence of your school? Contract negotiations are still in flux at this point. Some statewide contracts as well as the faculty contracts within MINSK are still being worked out. We have 6 new members of the Board of Trustees. I mentioned that Alfredo Oliveira was reappointed. Maria Peluso is our new community college student trustee, but we also have 4 additional board members that were just appointed. Also, tuition setting is an issue to keep in mind. There was a tuition cap in place for the current school year for 2012 and 2013. That will expire at the end of 2013. So when you're on campus talking about your budget and tuition for the next school year, there won't be a tuition cap in place. And so that's an important thing to know. And then secondly, there have been cuts at the state level in terms of appropriations that are going to affect how you talk about the budget on campus and what that means for tuition. So knowing that cap is about to expire and that the system has less money to work with are very important things to know going into consultation. Now I want to move on to the legislative climate and where things are at as a state. Important things to know from the last session in 2012. That was what's called a bonding year. So our institutions received money from the state through bond sales to build new facilities or to preserve the buildings that we currently have. And so the system got almost $95 million in bonding money to fix our facilities, renovate our facilities, or to build new facilities. The system also received $457,000 in what they call leveraged equipment acquisition, which basically just means that our schools have money from the state they can use to buy state-of-the-art equipment for our career and technical programs. Any funds that our campuses use have to be matched by the campus themselves. So ultimately there's close to $1 million in equipment purchases. And then again, knowing that that tuition cap was in place for this school year, it wasn't put into effect this session, but it was still impacting this session and won't be there next year. For this upcoming session in 2013, we all know there's a big election coming up in November, and many of you are engaged with our Speak Up, Get Out the Vote work on campus, so keep up the good work on that. All of the representatives are up this year, so that's a really big deal, and it might change the composition of the legislature. It's also a budget year, meaning that our institutions will find out how much money they're going to be getting from the state for their operations for the next 2 years, and how much money of that's going to go to the MINSK system. As a state, not within MINSK, but Minnesota as a whole, is projecting just over $1 billion shortfall for the next biennium, and that's as of the February forecast. That seems like a lot of money, and it certainly is a lot of money, but it's much smaller than the over $5 billion budget deficit that we were facing the last biennium. So they'll be working with that shortfall. Within MINSK, I mentioned there were cuts. MINSK was cut 10% over the last biennium, which equates to about $60 million a year. So going into this session, MINSK is operating with less funding than they had 2 years ago. And then again, there's no tuition cap in place for the next upcoming school year. And so that's what's happening legislatively. Just a little bit about the higher ed budget. Higher education as a whole makes up about 7.5% of the overall state budget. And that's inclusive of all higher education. So not just funding to the MINSK system, but also funding to the University of Minnesota, as well as the Office of Higher Education to run the Minnesota State Grant Program. So higher education is obviously something that's very important to students and to our state, but it's a relatively small percentage of the overall state budget. And then this next chart just demonstrates visually the cuts that the MINSK system has faced over the last decade. You can see that state support is down 45% per full-time student in constant dollars there. So where the system was receiving just over $4,800 per student back in 2000, they're down to just over $2,600 just for this last fall. And the last chart I was going to share with all of you is that reversal of the relationship between tuition and appropriation in the state. So you can see this blue line here represents how much funding the MINSK system has received as a percentage of their overall revenue, and the red shows how much of that revenue as a percentage comes from tuition. So you can see back in 2000, the state was providing 2/3 the cost of education, with students picking up that other third, and then it started to reverse and is almost completely reversed as of this fall, with tuition making up just over 60%, almost 61% of overall revenue. So that, in a nutshell, is the status of higher education in Minnesota this year. Thank you all for your participation. And again, this recorded webinar will be available on our website for other students on your campus or other MSCSA members to access at any time. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon.